as you make your maps, there's a lot of things that you're going to want to consider and other bumps in the road that you may hit. And I want to help you in this video think about some of those, address them, and just know that they're out there. The first one is a technical one, and it's something called projections. And this is the concept of putting a spherical Earth, like the countries and land masses of Earth, onto a flat surface. And when you make that transition, there's some math that needs to happen, and there are hundreds of different ways to make that calculation. And the way that is done in any given case, whether it be a shapefile or some map, that is a projection. And there are hundreds of them, but you can use MapShaper to convert the projection that your file is in into one that you want to be using. So let me just show you. Here I have a shapefile of the entire globe, flat here. And then this is the Mercator projection, but I can go over here and click on Console and type in this window over here, -PROJ space EQ Earth, that stands for equal Earth. And you can see the representation of the globe changes, especially with the land masses closer to the poles. You can see that changes a little bit. I can change this back to a web Mercator. This is the standard that's used very commonly for Mapbox and Google Maps and other things. So often we're converting to web Mercator in our maps. And to do that, you type -PROJ space WGS84. And that will change it to this web Mercator, and we'll be using that for Mapbox. So projections are a big thing, and it's something you should know about, but I just really wanted to show you a quick way to get it into the projection that we'll be using if you need to do that in the future. The next item to consider is color. The colors you pick are editorial decisions, and so you really need to think about it. Not just, is this map pretty, but how is this representing the data that's there? This is especially true when you're mapping people, which you often are, and races and ethnicities. You really need to be sensitive about this. And so think carefully about the colors that you're using. Remember things like reds. In many cultures, red means bad or danger. Red can mean, in the United States, it could mean the political right. In other parts of the world, it's the political left. So again, colors, like for any chart, color is important, and you need to think carefully about what colors you want to be using. In that same vein, you want to be careful about color classification. We talked a little bit about this when we were making our data wrapper map, and we're actually going to table this topic because we're going to have an expert on this talk in just a couple of more videos. So hang on to that idea, and we'll address that then. You also want to consider your audience that may be colorblind. So sticking with the theme of color, Data Wrapper has some buttons that allow you to check that. So if you're using Data Wrapper, but there are also browser plugins and apps that will actually let you simulate what your chart or map will look like to somebody with different kinds of color blindness. One of those is Color Oracle. That is an app that is available for Macs and PCs and Linux systems that actually turns whatever's on your screen, whether it's a map or a chart or a web page, and represents it as a colorblind person might see it in different forms of color blindness. So no matter what your abilities, you can see pretty easily what it might look like, and make sure that those colors that you're using are still able to be differentiated even by somebody who has a form of color blindness. Precision is the next thing I want to talk to you about. So what do I mean by that? Well, when you put a pin or a dot on the planet, as we will be doing next week with Mapbox, you actually have to give the software a latitude and longitude on which to put that dot. So if we're saying, okay, we're going to put a pin or a dot in New York City, that latitude and longitude will be at New York City, but often it's something like City Hall. So if you mean that a story or an incident or a crime happened in New York City, but not at City Hall, you can quickly run into an issue, right? Because your user might be able to zoom all the way in and say, oh, that's where that happened. So in order to deal with that, one of the things you can do in all of these software programs is lock the amount of zoom that's possible. So people can't zoom all the way in, and that's an editorial decision to make sure that the precision isn't thought to be, oh, right here at City Hall, but more out here. This happened in New York City. So precision is something to consider. Next, counts inside shapes. What do I mean by that? Well, bigger shapes often have more things in them, whether it's people or cows or whatever. You will probably have, or you might have, more things in bigger shapes. So if your shapes aren't the same size, like counties or postal codes or other things, you want to make sure to use rates. Use per capita, use per 100,000, use rates that reflect the data that's in that area, so that making comparisons isn't reliant on the area of the shape. If you are doing something with area, and maybe it's number of things per square meter or per square mile or something like that, and you're using the area of the shapes, which is something that is possible, I have another caution for you. Beware of water. So a lot of counties and districts, and if you're working with the U.S. Census, census tracts will include areas of water, which is fine, that's great, except that if you're counting people per square mile, people generally don't live in the water. They live on the land. So you want to make sure that you're making those comparisons with the area of the land, not necessarily the area of the entire district or tract or county. The next one is maybe more of a style thing, but I really believe in it, and that is do one thing well. You and maybe your editor may be tempted to add different layers and put lots of different kinds of data onto your map. And I will just say that instead of putting too many things on a single map, make extra maps, make more maps. If you have 2 stories to tell or 2 things to show, make 2 maps. Yes, your audience may zoom and pan and do some interaction, but once you're asking them to understand the story by adding layers or adding more pins or anything along these lines, I think personally that it's a harder way to convey the story and asks maybe too much of your audience. So think about doing one thing really well, and if you need to make 2 things, do 2 maps. And finally, make sure there's a story to tell. Is it a mappable story? Just because you have a bunch of places or locations or shapes that you could map, should you? Let me give you an example. I was once asked to make a map of all the gas stations in New York City. So the story was about how there were fewer and fewer gas stations in New York City, and the reporter had the locations of them all in the city. So my question was, are we showing the decrease over time? Is that something we're mapping? No, didn't have that data. Okay. Is there some interesting distribution? Maybe they're all on one side of the city or related to some, demographics of the city. No, that wasn't the case. Okay, is it so people can find gas stations? No, people with cars know where the gas stations in the city are, and Google Maps is probably a better resource than we would be. No, it was just because we had the locations, and we really decided that a map doesn't actually help in this case. So think about that. Is your map telling a story? Does it further the story that it's accompanying? If it doesn't, don't make it. That's it for the tips and tricks in this video. In the next video, we'll talk about ethical considerations around location data, specifically locations of people and cell phones, data that you may very well come across and you may be tempted to map, but we should talk about whether you should.